Okay, thank you for having me. And I think kind of my talk would also very much dovetail what Dongo and Charles have been saying. So, I mean, I think I don't want to spend too much time. You know the kind of proportion of this crisis in Sri Lanka, right? It's unprecedented since probably the 1930s. Our economy has probably shrunk by 20% in the last 4 or 5 years. If you take any figures, malnutrition, poverty, food insecurity, everything is the worst that we have seen. And that's for a country that has had very high human development indicators, were seen as a model social development state. So what this crisis is doing. Now, how did we get here? Again, I think that there's a number of narratives about it. In the 70s, Sri Lanka was the first country to liberalize its economy in South Asia. We went through structural adjustments in 77, 78, so that's even before Reagan and Thatcher took power. So we were set on the path, but it didn't go as smoothly and there was a bubble. The biggest World Bank development project came at that time, but in 1983, we went into a civil war, and a very long one, that is, a 26-year-long civil war, which meant that they couldn't take forward the liberalization measures as fast as they'd want to because of the urgencies of war. Now, the kind of interesting question for me is we did not default, and this is the first time we've defaulted 2 years ago. We did not even default during this long civil war. If not for that, probably our GDP would have been twice or possibly thrice as the World Bank claims, right? That much slowed growth due to the civil war. So I've kind of made this argument that what happened, the end of the civil war in 2009 was the time of a second wave of neoliberalism in Sri Lanka. It also coincided with the North Atlantic financial crisis. Like Chandru said yesterday, it was a supply side push of capital. And Sri Lanka was the darling in 2010 to 2012. We were showing 8, 9, 10% growth. We had the best performing stock market in 2010, right? So all this capital coming into emerging markets and also what was then considered a post-conflict economy. And it was around that time that I also put forward this idea of a second wave of neoliberalism, and it was a regime that had won the war who talked about national sovereignty, and they are the ones who started selling sovereign bonds. So the irony of it was kind of there for many of us, and even at that time we saw this path was unsustainable. Commercial borrowings, particularly ISBs, the average of it something like 6.8%. You do the compound interest on a 10-year bond, your interest is almost, payments are going to be equal to your principal. So there's no way you're going to get those kinds of returns. But we were cheered on. In fact, in 2009, we went into an IMF agreement soon after the war. And then we were running into balance of payments. In 2016, we went into our 16th IMF agreement. So all of this was under the watch of the IMF. So there was a sort of an infrastructure binge without the returns, import binge, and then unsustainable debt stock. So this is how you can see from 2009, our debt stock, external debt stock increasing, and a lot of that was ISBs. So you can see we floated our first ISB in 2007. And then subsequently, it becomes about 40, just the ISBs, commercial borrowing about 52% of our external debt stock, ISBs about 40%. Now, I've kind of characterized what Sri Lanka is in now. I mean, people talk about the so-called Chinese debt trap. I actually call it an IMF trap that Sri Lanka is in. Why? Because, while we've had 17 IMF agreements, it's since 1965, this time around, having defaulted, they are also seen as the arbiter, right? So it's different in that now they have a real hold on us, and I'll say more about it. But this IMF as arbiter has also been sold, I would say, nationally as, that's what you need. You need the IMF to come there to be able to deal with corruption. For good governance, you need the IMF. Internationally, look, Sri Lanka has gotten into this Chinese debt trap, and you need the IMF to sort that out for you also. So if you look at the international media, it was all about the Chinese debt trap, even though if you look at our debt stock, the large share of it was commercial borrowing in the international capital markets. And then, so what are the major conditions of the IMF agreement? It's a primary budget surplus, and that we have to make progress with debt restructuring. So who's really running the show now? We defaulted 2 years ago. In March last year, we went into our 17th IMF agreement. It's been a little over a year. So my research team and I we looked at it, and we thought that there's actually no national policy at the moment. If you want to follow what's happening in Sri Lanka, just look at the IMF benchmarks. Go to the IMF agreement, look at the IMF benchmarks, and you can, all that our government is doing is just implementing it, and we have a very strong neoliberal regime in power. All they're doing is just implementing the IMF benchmarks. So whether it's revenue measures, changes in laws, when it comes to fiscal consolidation, then a push towards banking sector changes, and then, of course, SOE reform, so privatization. But the IMF agreement also comes with the World Bank, right? So people talk about an IMF bailout. The IMF agreement is $3 billion over 4 years. So that's averages to about $60 million a month. Even today, how is Sri Lanka running? It's running on 30 times that much, 1.8 billion in foreign earnings. So there's no IMF bailout. The World Bank and the ADB gave an additional amount of $4 billion over that 4 years as well. So even if you do that, we're still having 15 times as much as the IMF, World Bank, and ADB put together. But they are deciding on all our policies to the dot. So while the IMF sets the benchmarks, so I tell everyone, just read the IMF agreement and you read the World Bank Country Partnership Framework, and then you don't have to worry about what our finance ministry is doing or anything like that, because it's to the dot. And what does the country partnership framework look like over the next 48 months? Or they started in June last year. The first 18 months, they want to see all kinds of legal changes, right? And then the next 30 months, they're going to help bring about those. So laws on land, laws on fisheries, laws on, going to have a law on private-public partnership, all the kind of laws, and they're pushing it on a government. And the latest World Bank update that says, even though we have elections, that these laws should be pushed forward before and after the election. So the actors who claim to bring governance and democracy, the way in which they're pushing it through with a illegitimate regime. So what is the government doing? If you read the budget for 2024, the president came out and said, this year he's going to push through 60 new laws and amendments. Anti-terrorism bill, online safety bill, all these repressive laws, along with a bunch of laws that the IMF and the World Bank wants us to push through. So the state has a very clear repressive agenda. The IMF and the World Bank are setting the terms of how we're going to move forward. The impact of the crisis, maybe I won't spend too much time here. Interest rates were hiked soon after the crisis from 6% to 16.5%. Effective lending rates from commercial banks were around 29%. Thousands of SMEs went bankrupt. 500,000 formal sector jobs were lost for a formal sector of 8 million workers. So you can imagine the impact. Real wages have halved, and all in the name of fighting inflation. And we knew all along it was a one-time shock, supply side, in terms of the devaluation of the rupee and the shock in commodity prices with the war in Ukraine. But the impact of it has been to really repress the economy, and I argue that now we are in a deflationary cycle. And what do? Every time inflation is going below zero, they increase taxes to try to push it up, right? Increase the price of fuel. We've market priced. So this game is also going on with inflation targeting, but I think we're in this really dangerous scenario of a deflationary scenario. So this is, it was at 70%. Sorry, I didn't have the graph from 2022. And now it's zero. Food prices went even negative, which means there's no incentive for food producers to produce, right? If prices are falling like that, what are you going to do at the end of the season? You might as well hold on to cash. So this is what happened to central bank interest rates. And then you can look at a number of data. If you look at cement consumption, so a lot of 68% of our workforce, the informal sector, fishermen, farmers, they all depend on off-season, on construction work, mason work. Cement consumption in Sri Lanka is almost a third from, say, 6 years ago. If you look at the fuel consumption, it went down to 50%. It's still down about 35 to 40% from a few years ago. So you can see the impact of all these austerity measures on the economy. And one of the demands of the IMF is market pricing energy, and you can see what's happened to fuel prices. So people are traveling less. Firms are producing less because they just can't afford the fuel bill. And Sri Lanka is known certainly in the developing world. We had 99% of our people were connected to the electricity grid. And last year, 1 million households of, say, 5.6 million households have lost their connectivity to the electricity grid, right? So it's the kind of, and the brutality of how this is playing out with the kind of measures. The DSA, I think the president came out and said last year when they went with domestic debt restructuring that they would do a 30% haircut is what they were aiming for. The bondholders, I think, came out with 20%, but they said it should be macro-linked bonds. So on the upside, it can be just a 11% haircut. So they are playing hardball, the bondholders. And the external GFN target, gross financing needs target, is 4.5%, which would amount to about 30% of our revenue over the next 10 years when we start paying back our debt. So that's what the IMF's DSA looks like. And if you look at what happened last year with pressure from bondholders, again, we have a regime that is bending over backwards to please the IMF and the bondholders. They went through domestic debt restructuring, and which has really hit retirement funds. And Sri Lanka, the formal sector, you have compulsory savings, which is overseen by the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. So the central bank put forward a proposal, the government accepted it, and they went ahead with domestic debt restructuring of the fund that they maintain. They are the custodians. And my projection is that we lose about 47% for somebody who comes in and then over the 16-year period of debt restructuring. And then the end goal of this IMF agreement is, if you look at the IMF agreement, in 2027, when we exit the IMF program, we will be blessed with a $1.5 billion US sovereign bond. So we're going through all this to be able to float an ISB. So this is kind of what I've done with retirement funds. They're going to take out 0.5% of GDP in GFN with cuts to the returns on retirement funds. Over a 16-year period, our GFN average, the stock of our retirement funds was anywhere between 16 and 19%. So over 16 years, it's going to decline as a percentage of GDP by 8%. And that's how I get this 47%. So all of this and kind of what is really hidden in terms of this debt restructuring process, right? If you look at the DSA, our debt is only going to come to 95%. Probably the next shock will push us into default again. I don't see it sustainable. But I think there's a hidden logic. Real wages are down 50%, so they think in the long term you can export your way out, but it's going to be a race to the bottom. We're going to be competing with Bangladesh and all these countries with garment sector and so on. What is not said is the extent to which all the laws that I mentioned, the privatization push. So you kill two birds with one stone, right? You get hopefully you'll get foreign investors coming in, and then the government also gets revenue. You get to meet the budget surplus targets. But even more than that, I think what is insidious and is the extent to which, and it's not seen, is that the household is actually being. So when we're thinking of debt restructuring, we're thinking at the macro level, but I think it's really being the kind of spatio-temporal fix is at the household level, right? People are eating much less. A lot of, in the rural areas, people are just eating 1 or 2 meals a day. People are traveling much less. So that's how this restructuring is being absorbed. And, the likely scenario is repeated IMF agreements and repeated defaults. So in thinking about alternatives, there's some ideas about maybe we should push for wealth taxes. I think that was mentioned. I think the main thing I want to sort of say here in the last few minutes is the last day and a half we've been talking about global governance. How is this global picture going to change with this debt crisis, right? And the new financial architecture. I think, like some of you, I'm also very pessimistic that we're going to see, at least in time for Sri Lanka to come out of this, the kind of changes, right? Then there's a question of, okay, what can we do at the macro level, at the national level? If you look at our regime, you look at our neighbor in India, I mean, the regime's in power, and even the idea of debtors club, I mean, these guys are much more happy to be sitting in Washington or London. We don't have that kind of leadership, though we need to work towards it. I'm not saying that we don't work towards at these two levels. We need to work at the national level. But I think I was really glad that Charles brought up the whole agrarian question and the food system, right? Because that is where, for me, we have to, I feel that, at least in Sri Lanka, we have to start. That's where, if you look at the food system, what were we told to do over the last 20, 30 years? Sri Lanka is an island nation. They said, get into these high-value seafood species. So we were exporting $250 million of seafood. And I do research on fishers, and I'm a kind of an advisor to the fishing community in the north. Every year, we were importing $200 million of seafood, which is dry fish, moldy fish, which is 60% of our animal protein. What happens when you go into a balance of payment crisis? You're still exporting your seafood. You're using that to buy other essentials. You're not able to import your animal protein that you need for your population. So a focus on the food system, right? And how this whole debt crisis is going to reshape the agrarian landscape, right? I feel that there isn't enough. I'm putting forward a challenge that we should really be thinking about how this debt crisis is going to drastically change the agrarian landscape. And that is so crucial for survival in many of these countries. Otherwise, you're going to lose a generation in Sri Lanka, and not just in terms of education, but through malnutrition. And we've seen that during the civil war in the northern parts of the country. I think it's going to affect much of the country. I agree with Dongo. I was also thinking about this, the title of our panel, whether it's debt crisis resolution. I think what we need now is debt crisis disruption, right? And how do we work towards that, right? How do we get farmers and fisher folk and so on to put pressure on the government to exit from this IMF agreement, how to disrupt this. Because if you look at the numbers in terms of how are we surviving, it's not because of the IMF, it's from our own foreign earnings. But how we do the disruption in a way that other things don't get hit is a big question. And the last point I'll say is that all of this, where in a country like Sri Lanka, also geopolitics is over determining the debt resolution process, right? So suddenly they're using both private actors where necessary. So the Adani group is, as a proxy for India, investing something like 1.5 billion US dollars with the support of the US government, which is giving them 500 million of that. The Chinese CPETCO, the Chinese Sinopec is bringing $4.5 billion. The Australians, as part of Quad, are talking about a $2 billion US dollar floating solar project, right? But these are not going to bring anything for the working people in Sri Lanka, but it's pitched as renewable, so I think it ties in with the theme tomorrow, but maybe we can talk more about that. Thank you.
Keep going.